A happy Palm Sunday to you. If my reckoning is correct, this continuation of my series on alleged composite discourses in Matthew will be released on Palm Sunday. I will probably take a break from this series for what I release next week, because that's Easter Sunday, April 20th, 2025, but I haven't decided what I'm going to do for that yet. For today, I'm going to continue this series about alleged composite discourses in Matthew. Now, if you watched or listened to last week's presentation, you know what is meant by a composite discourse and why I think this is interesting. I'm going to resist the temptation to recap that because it will add to the length of this video. But you will also know that, as I read last week some quotations from D.A. Carson's commentary on Matthew, in that commentary, Carson rejects the idea that Matthew made composite discourses with brackets. Now, what do I mean by brackets? And what is Carson talking about? Well, I'm going to give the example for the Sermon on the Mount, which is one of the most famous sermons where scholars think it was composite, that Matthew collected things and then made it appear that Jesus said them on an occasion, but he really didn't. Now, what makes it appear that he said it on an occasion is the brackets on both ends. It's not even like he gives sort of a setting and Jesus starts talking and then it kind of wanders off and might or might not continue talking about that same setting. I think that that latter thing actually happens sometimes in Luke. But in these cases of these discourses in Matthew, it doesn't happen because he comes back for a bracket on the other end. So here are the two brackets. Opening bracket, Matthew 5, 1 and 2. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. He opened his mouth and began to teach them, saying, okay. Now, in a later episode of this series, I'm going to talk about the Sermon on the Level Place in Luke and the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew and the plausible relationships between those. I'm not going to talk about that today. But what you can at least see is that he's starting off by saying that he went up on a mountain and began to teach. Interesting, the them is probably the disciples and the crowd, though the nearest antecedent is the disciples, saying, all right, well, but maybe as he goes on for, 5, 6, 7, 3 whole chapters, maybe he doesn't continue putting it in that context. No, it kind of seems that he does continue putting it in that context, because Matthew 7:28 says, when Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching. And as you'll recall from last time, Carson places a lot of emphasis on that the closing bracket seems to be referring to what has come before. And sometimes they'll even say, all these things or something. But finish these words. The crowds were amazed at his teaching. All right, so we also discussed last time that there's not really independent evidence of something as specific as a composite discourse. So the argument is taken from the mere presence of what appear to be parallel sayings in other synoptic gospels. Carson laid that out very clearly too, that there are these two things, many individual bits of each discourse, I'm quoting Carson here, find synoptic parallels in other settings. And then he says, many think the second point to be so strong that they conclude that Matthew himself composed the discourses. And then he says, the conservative version of this is that the sayings are all authentic, but they didn't happen on that occasion, or some of them did and some of them didn't, and Matthew is compiling them. But then Carson kind of comes back to the problem is with this closing bracket at the end of several of Matthew's discourses. Okay. So why is the fact that we find parallel sayings elsewhere in the other synoptic gospels, Mark and Luke, considered to be so strong? Okay, I'm going to focus on the use of Luke to argue for composite discourses, at least for this week, possibly for the next couple weeks. I'll be focusing on the use of Luke. Okay, and I want to tease out some of the implicit premises that have to be used when Luke is set against Matthew in the presence of a saying in Luke that is not in a discourse that could plausibly be the same as the Sermon on the Mount, is then used to argue that Matthew must have grabbed it, knowing it wasn't said within the Sermon on the Mount, and added it as part of a composite discourse, namely the Sermon on the Mount. That he created composite discourses. Okay, what are the premises here? Well, we start out with a saying or group of sayings occurs in Luke in a different setting from the discourse setting in Matthew. Okay, or, so this premise is a disjunction. Okay, either a saying or group of sayings occurs in a different setting in Luke, or a saying or group of sayings occurs in Luke somewhere or other in Luke's large central section, which central section starts at a point later in Jesus' ministry. So Luke's central section is huge, and I have I believe at least one, maybe more than one, video on Luke's central section. It starts at Luke 9:51, and it goes somewhere into the teens. I don't remember the exact place where it breaks off, but it's very large, and it contains a lot of achronological material. That'll be important here. But as part of this disjunction in this argument, okay, Luke's large central section starts at a point later in Jesus' ministry than where Matthew places the Sermon on the Mount. So Luke 9:51, that seems to have a chronological placement, which seems to be later than when the Sermon on the Mount would have occurred. Therefore, we must take Luke to be chronologically placing any such sayings late in Jesus' ministry. Very questionable. Okay, very questionable premise. All right. So there's a disjunctive premise. Then another premise. Luke represents Q better than Matthew. Now, I'll talk about that one in a minute, but that has to be in here. That Q is Matthew's source, and what's in Luke represents Q better than what's in Matthew. All right. Then, if Matthew is dependent on Q, which is, because of the previous premise, represented by Luke's placement of the saying, he is wholly dependent on Q for that saying. He could not have had any other evidence of his own about when Jesus said something like this, either in addition to Luke's placement, like Jesus said it in more than one occasion, or in a more specific context than Luke's placement. This is very questionable. And I've talked about this, the rigid rule of all or nothing independence and dependence. Okay, so if Matthew's dependent on Q, Luke represents Q, then that's the only source he has factually. Therefore, when Matthew places this saying in a discourse, even a bracketed discourse, he must be knowingly placing it in a context where it did not occur. All right, that's what the argument has to be when we're talking about sayings that find parallels in Luke elsewhere, either in a different setting or in a non-specific setting, but after Luke 9:51. Okay, so what are we doing? We're ruling out Jesus teaching something similar twice, which is very dubious, and I'll be emphasizing this throughout the entire series, and I might have a whole video just on this, but I just think about the number of times I say the same thing in an interview. I even have suggested interview questions that I'll sometimes when asked or when the interviewer desires it, I'll sometimes send these suggested questions to them. And I've got answers that are going to be very similar in wording that I'm going to give again and again. If you're a teacher, you probably give the same lecture again and again. Okay. My former Anglican priest, who's now passed away, he wrote his sermons and he would give them each year on the same Sunday in the liturgical year. And of course, Jesus didn't write down his sermons, at least we don't have reason to think he did, but even verbally, you get used to teaching the same material in a variety of contexts, and I'll be emphasizing that a lot. So this argument rules that out, but then it also imposes on Luke a degree of chronological precision in a setting where actually Luke appears to be much less precise, and just insists that if it occurs, at that later point in Luke's gospel, just a later chapter, then we have to take that to be chronologically later, even though Luke's central section is just famously achronological. I want to read Carson making this same point. If I can get the correct page here. I just hate when this happens with my notes. All right. Even if, says Carson, as I am willing to assume, Luke's central section is framed by certain historical journeys to Jerusalem, it is only to be expected that topical material is also incorporated, because many of Luke's transitions between pericopes, when he uses them at all, are chronologically imprecise. What this means for a commentator on Matthew is that each apparent parallel between a pericope in Matthew and one in Luke's central section must be assessed on its own merits. In some cases, they probably refer to the same event, in others not, and in some instances, the evidence may be such that a convincing decision is impossible. Okay, this is really important. The imprecision of Luke's transitions, and sometimes the complete absence of Luke's transitions. I've emphasized this in a different situation with a different set of premises and arguments concerning Luke's alleged editorial fatigue in use of Matthew, where Luke is the one allegedly changing facts, and it's supposed to be a case of editorial fatigue. And Dr. Lacona says that Luke changes the time when Jesus said his saying about a millstone and one of these little ones to a different context. And as I argue in the Mirror of the Mask, there literally is no context in Luke. And Lacona says he moves the story, and there literally is no story. It's just like this heap of sayings about offenses and so forth. So what are you talking about? He moves the story, or it's in a different context. Well, in that case, that's being used to argue that Luke changed something. In this case, the failure to note the achronological nature of Luke is being used to argue that Matthew changed something, that Matthew had only Q to rely on. Q didn't give him the setting in a Sermon on the Mount, and so Matthew must have made up the setting in a Sermon on the Mount. We don't have Q. I think Q may have been a shorter version of Matthew. It might be Hebrew Matthew, but in that case, Matthew's perfectly entitled to just give sayings without settings in something shorter and more of a sayings document, and then put in the settings that he knows about, that he has additional information about, in a longer version. But in any event, even if Q existed, there's no reason to take Luke to be more representative of Q than Matthew time after time. And even more, we should not be claiming that Luke is being chronological and Matthew is not being chronological, when the appearance is exactly the other way around. It's completely backwards. Now, scholars don't always take Luke to be more representative of Q. Even those who believe in Q, even those who think that a person made something up, don't always do it that way. And in fact, the same scholar will sometimes take Luke to be more representative of Q and sometimes take Matthew to be more representative of what was in Q. And there's a lot of arbitrariness in there. You shouldn't assume that they're just doing this because there's some strong evidence. But it's really backwards to take the less chronologically precise placement of a saying to be chronologically normative. Okay? It not only rules out the very live possibility that Jesus taught similar things on more than one occasion, but it treats less precise placement as being normative and as taking precedent over Matthew's clearer and more precise placement. Why in the world would we do that? Why should we do that? Prima facie, the less precise placement is not in competition with the more precise placement. And the more precise placement provides more information that we can then use, additional information. So it gets it exactly backwards. Now, to see what I'm talking about, I want to give a couple of concrete examples. So I'm going to start with something in Luke 14. Now, it's really hard to even find any placement at all. It so often happens in Luke. You have to kind of go back a good, 9-10 verses. And Luke 14:25, you just find out great multitudes were going along with him, and he turned and said to them. And then you got all this stuff. Well, there's great multitudes coming to him in the Sermon on the Mount as well. So it's not clear. But also, then there's 9 verses, so you don't know, is that still supposed to be, the same occasion as 14:26? By the time we get to 14:34, therefore salt is good, but if even salt has become tasteless, with what will it be seasoned? It is useless either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown out. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. All right, so there's this saying about salt, and if salt is tasteless. And it's just not in a very clear chronological setting. So let's go over to the Sermon on the Mount now. Matthew 5:13 says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how will it be made salty again? It is good for nothing anymore except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men." So it's a very similar saying, to be sure, in the Sermon on the Mount, which again is bracketed in this way that I said, but it's in a much less precise placement. Okay? Both of them seem to be talking about Jesus' followers, calling upon them to be good salt, rather than salt that has lost its savor. Did Jesus say it twice? Maybe even more than twice? We've got 2 of them recorded. Or is Luke's far less precise placement an indicator that Luke is just talking about following Jesus, okay, and gathering sayings that Jesus said to a multitude about following him, and Matthew knows more about the time when it was actually said. Now, I think this is evidence, and I want to put this in here, that Luke didn't have our Greek Matthew. So to me, this is some of the stronger evidence for the existence of something or other in the neighborhood of Q. Remember that Q material refers to material that's found in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. Some people won't know that, but it does. Which, as I said before, might be Hebrew Matthew or Aramaic Matthew, which the church fathers do refer to. So it's not a completely hypothetical document. I think it's plausible to say that if Luke had our Greek Matthew, and were depending upon it as his source, it would be unlikely that he would, strip off chronological placements and then put something in a chronologically imprecise location. That seems like a kind of a complex maneuver. Fine, but why should we conclude the other way around, that Matthew knew that he did not know when Jesus said this, or knew that Jesus said it only later in his ministry, and then grabbed it and deliberately made it appear that he said it earlier in his ministry in this bracketed, relatively early discourse, the Sermon on the Mount? That's not a good reason to take it that way, just because it's in a chronologically imprecise setting in Luke. All right, I'm going to give one more such example. Okay, and this is found earlier in Luke. Okay, it's about not being anxious. Very famous passage about don't be anxious. All right, and he's been talking about not laying up treasure for yourself, not being concerned with money. Again, if you go back, this is Luke 12. If you go back from the sayings about not being anxious, approximately 9 verses, it's still quite a few verses, to verse 13, and someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." All right, so this is a case where we have Luke kicking it off with a specific incident, somebody apparently being concerned about money, telling Jesus to tell his brother to divide the inheritance with him, and then kind of goes on, and Jesus does answer, but then we just get these imprecise connectives as he goes on. All right, and he said to them, verse 15, and he told them a parable, saying, okay, so is the man who lays up treasures for himself and is not rich toward God. That's this parable found only in Luke of the man who laid up treasures in the rich fool, it's sometimes called. And then we get to verse 22. And he said to his disciples, again, the and there, you might see it translated then, as though we know that it happened immediately after what's in the preceding verse. That's not true. It's a very imprecise connective, de, which John Wenham discusses in his book on Easter, that often it just shouldn't even be translated. For this reason I say to you, do not be anxious for your life, and so forth. All right, and that goes on for a while, rather similarly to Matthew. Very similar. We go over here to the Sermon on the Mount. All right, Matthew 6. Verse 25, for this reason I say to you, do not be anxious for your life as to what you shall eat or what you shall drink. And this is several verses worth, telling people not to be worried and so forth. That you should consider the birds and so forth, and God feeds them, and that you can't add to your lifespan, and you just shouldn't be anxious. Okay. Very similar, but much less chronologically precise in Luke. The nearest indicator is way back in verse 13, where the man asks him to divide the inheritance between that man and his brother. Now, I want to raise the perhaps seemingly implausible possibility that could have been someone at the time of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus often interacts with the crowd when he's talking. We see this in various Gospels. We even see it in the Gospel of John pretty strongly. Someone will call out a question, and then Jesus will respond to that. No, that's not found in Matthew, but again, Matthew doesn't have to be claiming he's recording everything Jesus said on that occasion. There's a difference between saying Matthew brackets it, so he's indicating that what he records was said on that occasion, and his bracketing meaning that he's recording everything that was said on that occasion. Those are not the same thing. So that could have been, that's a possibility, that Luke's got an independent source as to some additional things Jesus said on that occasion, but he doesn't know when it was again. And someone in the crowd said to him, like, when was that? It's in this big central section in Luke. But it's also possible that after recording Jesus' specific answer to the person in the crowd, Luke's just going on and chunking in achronologically sayings about being greedy and being concerned for money and so forth topically. And that's exactly what Carson brings up, that Luke is famously topical in this section. Okay, so the similarity of the wording doesn't have to mean that Luke is placing that at a later time in Jesus' ministry. Luke is so achronological, so why are we treating Luke as giving us a chronological setting and then treating the more precise Matthew, who also gives us a chronological setting, as in competition, and then judging it in favor of Luke and saying, okay, Matthew must be collecting chronologically? That's very confused in a number of different ways. Concerning salt, I also want to read a quotation from Carson that supports the possibility that the salt saying was said more than once. Salt and light are such common substances, compare Pliny, nothing is more useful than salt and sunshine, that they doubtless generated many sayings. Therefore, it is improper to attempt a tradition history of all gospel references as if one original stood behind the lot. And that's a very important reminder on the part of Carson. All right, and then I close off this section in the Mirror of the Mask. There are some places where Luke does seem to have different settings for similar sayings or teachings. But what is interesting is that there are relatively few of these once we have set aside the other types of material, that is to say, achronological material in Luke. Once their number is whittled down accordingly, we should have very little trouble admitting the possibility that Jesus taught these things twice. All right, so what we've seen here is part of this supposed knockdown argument that Matthew is accumulating sayings and narrating them dyschronologically by placing them into bracketed discourses is composed of a lot of very questionable premises, often arbitrary premises, but these things take on a life of their own within the discipline, and then other people just follow them without stopping and questioning them and saying, why are we taking Luke to be chronological there? Or why are we taking Luke to represent Q there and more than Matthew? Or why are we taking it that Matthew couldn't have had any other information besides what he found in Q? All of these are questionable. So I hope you'll come back next time. I think after Easter, I will be probably talking about the Sermon on the Level Place. Now I gotta go think of what to say that I haven't said before for Easter. I may just share something I've already done for Easter. We'll see. But thank you again. Please hit like and subscribe to the Lydia Magruder channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.